most precious, sweetest that ever.
Before we read our main text, let's be reminded of what Jesus said earlier near the beginning of the sermon. In Matthew 5 and verse 20, he said, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter the kingdom of heaven." Now he said this with respect to keeping the commandments of God as they were given in the law and the prophets, while they were in effect, to do and teach God's law. And this would exceed the scribes and Pharisees who taught but did not do, and often taught their traditions above God's law. Well, Jesus then goes on to lay down kingdom principles and precepts, which contrast and go beyond the code of the law. While it may also be true that the people were not keeping the law of Moses as it was intended in many cases. So while he accurately recites the law they had heard, whether they had misunderstood, abused, and failed to keep it or not, he then gives a more spiritual rule to follow. Let's read Matthew chapter 5, verses 38 to 42. "You have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth.' But I tell you not to resist an evil person. But whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. And whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away." Now Luke also records a portion of this in Luke 6, 29 and 30, couching it within Jesus' teaching about love for one's enemies. Now that teaching is soon to follow in Matthew's record. And whether Matthew and Luke record the exact same occasion or not, they each arrange the material to suit a thematic purpose. Well, for our purposes here, we'll take the accounts as parallel. So the passage we just read offers yet another principle of Christ that may be very challenging to us. It represents a radical shift in attitude, just as radical as considering anger equivalent to murder, looking with lust as adultery in the heart. It outlines a restriction that may be even more difficult to surrender to than that of eliminating divorce and oath swearing. And in terms of practical application, this teaching may stimulate more questions than any of the others so far. I'll try to address some of that a little bit later in the study. First, let's consider the law Jesus addresses. Verse 38, "You have heard that it was said, 'An eye for an eye, and a tooth for a tooth.'" This precept is given at least 3 times in the law of Moses, and it's important to recognize it was given as a matter of due process and justice, not for personal retaliation or personal vengeance. For example, in Exodus 21, beginning in verse 22, the Bible says, "If men fight and hurt a woman with child so that she gives birth prematurely, yet no harm follows, he shall surely be punished accordingly, as the woman's husband imposes on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." So in this circumstance, judges were required to mete out the due punishment, the due justice. The law did not give a man the right to immediately rise up and take personal vengeance, to act as judge, jury, and executioner, so to speak. Now the same precept is given for another situation in Leviticus 24, verses 17 through 22, concerning murder, the killing of an animal, or disfigurement of a neighbor. And again, the punishment and or restitution was determined by judges in a lawful court. A third instance is given in Deuteronomy chapter 19, and we'll begin reading in verse 16. If a false witness rises against any man to testify against him of wrongdoing, then both men in the controversy shall stand before the Lord, before the priests and the judges who serve in those days. And the judges shall make careful inquiry. And indeed, if the witness is a false witness, who has testified falsely against his brother, then you shall do to him as he thought to have done to his brother. So you shall put away the evil from among you. And those who remain shall hear and fear. And hereafter they shall not again commit such evil among you. Your eye shall not pity. Life shall be for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot. Now, whose eye shall not pity? Well, specifically, the judges who investigated and decided the case lawfully. And really, this law of swift and fair retribution served as a deterrent to would-be criminals, that they might hear and fear. It also promoted law and order versus vigilantism. Now, very likely the Pharisees used this law to justify retaliation, but as far as I can tell, God has never sanctioned personal vengeance or returning evil for evil. The Bible said in Proverbs chapter 20, verse 22, "Do not say, 'I will recompense evil.' Wait for the Lord, and he will save you." And also in chapter 24, verses 28 and 29, "Do not be a witness against your neighbor without cause, for would you deceive with your lips? Do not say, 'I will do to him just as he has done to me. I will render the man according to his work.'" No, rather, the Lord says, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay." Now, there were times when the Lord executed his vengeance through his people, by his direction and with his authority, but ultimately the right of vengeance belongs to him alone. And he also gave his covenant people a system of justice, eye for eye, tooth for tooth. The law of Moses governed the people of God who were a physical nation. Its judicial precepts maintained order and a system of fairness. But in the kingdom of Christ, the people of God are a spiritual nation only, dispersed among the various kingdoms of men. And God has given authority to civil governments to execute justice. They are his minister of vengeance. And this is a benefit to the Christian and to all people when it is carried out appropriately. Even so, God's people are expected to have a new attitude toward personal injustices, a new attitude toward holding on what belongs to us, what we are entitled to, even toward what is fair. Now, the main principle here is non-resistance. And Jesus gives four examples to illustrate the principle. First, in verse 39, "But I tell you not to resist an evil person, but whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn the other to him also." And the word resist is from the Greek anthistemi, which means to stand against, oppose, resist. And clearly, Jesus is not saying that we cannot resist false teaching and evil practices by speaking the truth in love and humbly correcting those who oppose the truth. No, this is in the context of suffering personal injustices. So even more than forbidding personal vengeance, which was already forbidden under the law, he teaches a willingness to suffer the injustice, even without demanding retribution or restitution, without demanding what we feel we are entitled to, what is fair. And so this first example, a slap to the face, this may be slightly painful, but this kind of attack insults one's dignity and honor more than causing injury. And so any act of standing against that person would be a retaliatory act, motivated by anger and pride, and not some act of instinctive self-preservation. Now, earlier, Jesus said those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake are blessed. Although the principle of turning the other cheek doesn't seem to be limited to religious persecution. And certainly the concept of non-resistance is not what the Jews expected or desired of their Messiah. He was supposed to overthrow the Romans and restore Israel's national glory. Well, that's not what Jesus came to do, nor what he expected or desired of his followers. The scriptures prophesied about his non-resistance in many places. For example, Isaiah chapter 50, verse 6, I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who plucked out the beard. I did not hide my face from shame and spitting. And just as one example of its fulfillment, John records the time when Jesus was questioned by the high priest. In John chapter 18, beginning in verse 19, the high priest then asked Jesus about his disciples and his doctrine. Jesus answered him, I spoke openly to the world. I always taught in synagogues and in the temple where the Jews always meet, and in secret I have said nothing. Why do you ask me? Ask those who have heard me what I said to them. Indeed, they know what I said. And when he had said these things, one of the officers who stood by struck Jesus with the palm of his hand, saying, Do you answer the high priest like that? Jesus answered him, If I have spoken evil, bear witness of the evil. But if well, why do you strike me? So he did call out the injustice of what was done, but he did not rise up to strike back. He did not seek vengeance. Well, let's look at the second example in verse 40. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. The tunic here would be the common inner garment, like a shirt, while the cloak is the outer and more costly garment. And I understand it was common for a garment to be taken as a pledge in some legal situation, although it was not to be held overnight. And so Jesus teaches a willingness to suffer the loss of property. Now, in Luke's account, the order is reversed. Tunic, cloak, cloak, tunic. But the point is the same. We should have no interest in a battle over material things, tightly clutching our personal possessions. And so if a pledge or collateral, if some item is demanded of you in a lawsuit of some sort, offer even more to show your honesty and your integrity. Verse 41, and whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Now, this sort of compulsion was familiar to the Jews because of the Romans. A Roman soldier held the authority to conscript a Jew, forcing him to carry his equipment or whatever else he had for 1 mile. This was obviously inconvenient, but especially humiliating to the Jew living under Roman oppression. And so again, Jesus teaches not only a willingness to bear the loss, in this case of time and freedom, but to offer even more than is demanded. And we might infer to do so without grumbling. In other words, use the opportunity to show kindness and volunteer your services without resentment. And this principle can be applied in many situations in life today. Verse 42, give to him who asks you, and from him who wants to borrow from you, do not turn away. Certainly, God has always wanted his people to be generous to the needy. The law said in Leviticus 25, verse 35, if one of your brethren becomes poor and falls into poverty among you, then you shall help him, like a stranger or a sojourner, that he may live with you. Now, Jesus' teaching about giving to the one who asks would seem to assume a legitimate need. We are not obligated to enable bad behavior. In fact, we should not, such as giving to a drunkard, asking money for more alcohol, or some absurd request beyond any reasonable need. Now, it can be difficult sometimes to make that determination. We may not always know if there's a legitimate need. And so the key principle is to be a giving person. Be willing to suffer the loss in that case. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Acts 20, verse 35. And as Jesus will explain in the next part of the sermon, citizens of the kingdom of heaven are to extend this expression of love even toward one's enemies, those who are actively against us, who hate us, even who abuse us. Now, in Luke's parallel account, Luke 6, verse 30, Jesus says, "Give to everyone who asks of you, and from him who takes away your goods, do not ask them back." So again, we see the idea of giving and of non-resistance. In this case, not resisting the loss of personal property, nor demanding its return. Now, some years later, the writer of Hebrews would encourage the brethren to remember how they had endured past sufferings, being persecuted for the faith. He wrote in Hebrews 10, verse 34, "For you had compassion on me in my chains, and joyfully accepted the plundering of your goods, knowing that you have a better and an enduring possession for yourselves in heaven." So as we look over these things Jesus has taught, we may have many questions about practical application. To what extent must we be non-resistant, even passive? How far does turning the other cheek go? Or giving of our possessions, going the extra mile, how far does this go? Well, I think J.W. McGarvey's comment on verse 39 is worthy of consideration. This is the verse on turning the other cheek. He writes, "This command, which enjoins non-resistance, like most of the other precepts of this sermon, does not demand of us absolute, unqualified passivity at all times and under all circumstances. In fact, we may say generally of the whole Sermon on the Mount that it is not a code for slaves, but an assertion of principles which are to be interpreted and applied by the children of freedom. We are to submit to evil for principle's sake and to accomplish spiritual victories, and not in abject, servile spirit as blind followers of a harsh and exacting law. On the contrary, taking the principle, we judge when and how to apply it as best we can." Now, earlier we mentioned Jesus' example in patiently accepting injustice and suffering. And we also recognize his hour had come at that time. He had a suffering to accomplish, a baptism to undergo, a cup to drink. Before that hour came, he did not passively allow himself to be harmed. Now, he never retaliated, to be sure, but when his fellow Nazarenes took hold of him and dragged him to the edge of the cliff to throw him down, or when the Jews took up stones on several occasions to stone him, he escaped from them. He was able to do that. So certainly non-resistance does not preclude escape. But when his time came to fulfill his mission, and for obedience' sake he would not escape, Jesus allowed everything willingly and passively. He gave himself over completely. And his example is given as a pattern specifically to Christians who are servants, but expanded to all. Peter writes in 1 Peter chapter 2, beginning in verse 18, "Servants, be submissive to your masters with all respect, not only to those who are good and gentle, but also to those who are unreasonable. For this finds favor, if for the sake of conscience toward God a man bears up under sorrows when suffering unjustly. For what credit is there if, when you sin and are harshly treated, you endure it with patience? But if, when you do what is right and suffer for it, you patiently endure it, this finds favor with God. For you have been called for this purpose, since Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example for you to follow in his steps, who committed no sin, nor was any deceit found in his mouth. And while being reviled, he did not revile in return. While suffering, he uttered no threats, but kept entrusting himself to him who judges righteously. Servants do not have authority from God to run away from their masters, and so he calls on them to patiently bear unjust treatment. And all who do so, who suffer for what is right, have a blessing from God. Yet it is also written to slaves that if they can be made free, to do so. 1 Corinthians 7, verse 21. Well, the Apostle Paul was often mistreated, arrested, beaten, imprisoned for preaching the gospel, and he never fought back physically, as far as I can tell. But he did appeal to his Roman citizenship. He appealed to the law so that the injustice might come to an end. When a conspiracy was formed against him and he became aware of it, he appealed to the Roman commander for protection. Now, Paul never wanted harm to come to those who mistreated him. In fact, he pleaded with the Philippian jailer not to harm himself when he was about to commit suicide. Paul saved his life, and then, through the preaching of the gospel, saved his soul. And Paul would write concerning the apostles and other preachers of the gospel, when we are reviled, we bless. When we are persecuted, we endure. When we are slandered, we try to conciliate. 1 Corinthians 4, 12 and 13. And I think there is no contradiction between this description of their behavior and the fact that in Philippi, when the leaders of the city sent word for Paul and Silas to go away quietly, Paul demanded that they come down to the prison themselves, in person, to send them away. And so there may be situations where we can insist on our rights being upheld and honored. Well, in consideration of the principle of non-resistance, turning the other cheek, giving more than is demanded, going the extra mile, we can't possibly answer every question or speak to every specific situation, but we can remember that the context of Jesus' teaching is the suffering of personal injustices. And these are principles to be applied with wisdom, and the application may not look exactly the same for every person in every circumstance. Now, certainly we are never to return evil for evil. We are not to retaliate. And so if our dignity is insulted, or even our body injured, if we suffer the loss of personal property, if our time and freedom is appropriated or misappropriated, we are not to return the same. We are not to demand retribution, as in eye for eye, tooth for tooth. Rather, endure and bless. 2 Timothy 2, verse 24 says, "And the Lord's bondservant must not be quarrelsome, but be kind to all, able to teach, patient when wronged." As always, thank you for your time and consideration of these passages. And until our next study, I pray you have a wonderful day, and may God bless you.